This would be a very good replacement for AC Mountain. So we're testing all of these lines in the Variety State Performance Trial this year. So a couple of red wheat sister lines that we have are Michigan R8 and R9. These lines are a good example of how you can tailor varieties to management practices, meaning that these lines, if you keep the flag leaf clean on these lines, there's very high yield potential within these two lines. Now they are susceptible to stripe rust, needing a fungicide. However, these are the most scab resistant lines that we have tested both in the breeding program and in the state performance trial. So under intensive disease pressure, like you see to your right over here, these lines will accumulate very little down. So there's good scab resistance here as well. So we're going to take a walk down through here, so if you guys don't mind, we can take a stroll through the program. So again, you can see the genetics here. These two are sister lines, R8 and R9. And what you actually see, you see some of these white heads here that are white damaged heads throughout. You'll notice it. We have actually some eye spot through here. And you can see why it's called straw breaker actually in some of these plots actually. So now, I really like this line, Michigan R11. So if you're familiar with sunburst or starburst that's pretty widely planted in Michigan, this line has a yield advantage and has better foliar disease package. Very good resistance to stripe rust. It's a medium maturity, very full season variety, meaning that it will fill grain well into the grain fill period. So very good yield potential in this line. Oh, and feel free to ask any questions as we move along here. Feel free to ask any questions. Now, another trait, so we've talked about some disease resistance traits here. Now, another trait to consider is maturity. Now, selecting an earlier maturity variety can get you an extra 2, potentially 3 days of grain fill period, and that will translate into higher yield. There's a risk associated with that. If you look through this plot here, you'll notice that some of the basal spikelets on this spike have been affected by freeze damage, meaning that in mid-May, you know, we're not out of the woods yet in terms of freezing in mid-May. This line is the earliest that we have in the program, and it was caught by a little bit of freeze damage. So there is such a thing as too early. Now, W13 is a very good stable, high-yielding white wheat that we have in the program here. It's very well adapted specifically to Huron and Sanilac counties. You can see it's very good. It's a little bit taller, but has very good straw strength, and it does have very good yield potential. So some other important traits that I'll talk about in white wheat are pre-harvest sprouting resistance. That's a grain dormancy trait. That affects milling and baking quality and therefore marketability of your wheat varieties. So moving on, I've got a couple lines here that I'm actually fond of, W64 and W54. Now, we're starting to actually turn these pedigrees around. The parentage of this line, it is lodged, and that's a function of some of the fungal infection that we have here, a root rot infection. So. Now, that's a very good point. We have differences in plant architecture that would then dictate whether or not that would be it would be advantageous. Now, some lines like this, or the very first line, W3, a little bit taller plant architecture. Now, a PGR would help in that kind of a situation. Something like R11 that's already very short stature, you might not see as much profitability on that. So that's another good point. If you are pushing your management, i.e. higher nitrogen rates, multiple fungicide applications, higher nitrogen rates, you can actually bring that plant height down just with genetics. You can, from the tallest varieties, Red Dragon and AC Mountain, to the shortest varieties like Shirley and Sunburst, you can get a 7 to 8 inch reduction in height just with genetics. So that's something to consider when you're looking at our variety reports and the publications there. Now this line, W64, it's actually an ambassador by Jupiter Cross, if you're familiar with those varieties. They've been on the market for a few years now, and we're starting to derive some very good progeny from them. It has scab resistance, and it has resistance to very stable resistance to pre-harvest sprouting. Several years now, the PHS has stood up very well. Now W64 It's a very pretty line. It's on, but that I haven't noticed any issues with threshability, so I should have good threshability. Very good milling and baking quality. So when we talk about milling and baking quality, that really affects folks that are downstream, grain buyers, and it affects the marketing aspects of that. And when there's so much wheat on the global market, it's really an advantage to U.S. wheat and also wheat in Michigan to have a very high quality product that's competitive with other markets. Good. Any questions or comments as we? Yes, sir. You know, that's been debated. In some very arid environments, like in eastern Colorado, there is some advantage. These will photosynthesize when past senescence. So at physiological maturity, you can actually gain several bushels. It's been hard to document an advantage or disadvantage to actual awns. They're more of a nuisance, I would say. Is it anything with oil on it, they'll stick to. But there really isn't. They don't really separate out in terms of yield or even scab susceptibility. Some of the most scab-resistant lines that we have available in Michigan are bearded wheats. So it's more cosmetic than anything, I would say. What's that? Deer don't like it. That, you know, someone brought that up earlier. Yeah, exactly. So you know, if your fields are next to a corridor or in a wooded area, that could be an advantage. Yeah, it's more anecdotal, but yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, yeah, and that's why they graze a lot of beardless wheats. You know, they don't have that in pasture grasses. They're not you know, bred to have awns like that. It's an irritation to the eyes. When are you going to see some of these varieties commercially? Potentially next year. So I anticipate seed sales next fall or next summer. So these are in purification right now. So we will have a very small foundation increase available this fall. Yeah. So we do have material set aside. So fairly soon. So I started in 2013, and these all started as single plant selections in the summer of 2013. And so we've derived these as lines and yield tested them over several years now. So it's about a 7-year process to get to this point. So we do what we can by shortening it up. We have a couple tricks that we use to shorten up the breeding cycle, but it's still about a 7-year process. But we can turn the genetics around very quickly. So all of these lines that you see out here today, we've already made crosses with these and are selecting progeny within populations of these. So we're already moving forward with these genetics. So these new genetics are being recombined into even better genetics as we speak. So there's a lot more to see. Now I'd like to highlight the Fusarium head blight resistance of this line. If you're familiar with the gene that's been in the press, FHB1, that's recently been cloned, this line is having a little bit of trouble from the heat stress that we've experienced recently. But the crosses were made deliberately for scab resistance, and at minimum it's a good parent in our breeding program. But it does have it's a white weight that does have good resistance to scab, which has been hard to come by. So. And again, our 160, this line was advanced for its scab resistance, but it's not having a very good year all over, I guess. So I'd like to quickly move past this one, if you don't mind. Is anybody doing anything with growth regulators? I have not been, but that has been under investigation. Martin Nagelkirk has been working on, has done some of that work. He'd be the one to ask. Yeah, Martin's here today. So there has been some, particularly with, now I'm not going to remember the chemistry. It's not cyclocel, that's not labeled for the U.S. It'll come to me in a minute. But so you can get genetics though that have shorter plant architecture. You can see there's a marked difference even between these two lines here. R213, very productive line. Now this is the contrast where there's the heads, there might be fewer spikelets per spike, but there's a larger number of them, right? And so it has very good tillering. So if you're looking at a lighter seeding rate, less of a seeding rate, this would be the variety that you would want to look into. Very good stripe resistance. That's what's really carried it through last year, is the stripe resistance, and it does have scab resistance as well. So R13 is one of this is one of our better reds. So R11, R213 are probably two of the best reds that we have in the program at this time.
And that was crossed with a Jupiter?
Which one? Oh, R213. Yes, it's a top cross to Jupiter, actually. So it was originally intended for scab resistance. Truman, if you remember that line from 8 years ago, by a Missouri line. So it's top cross to Jupiter. It doesn't really have, generally you pick up the Jupiter color and plant architecture in the top crosses, but it's 50% Jupiter. Yes, absolutely. It's still a red wheat, yeah. So you'll actually get segregate. You can cross reds and whites quite readily. And so the grain color is just a trait that segregates, and so by the time we're yield testing them, they're usually either red or white. So, yeah, yep. So we cross reds by whites all the time. So, good question. Any other comments or questions? Yes, sir.
Just in answer to that question, are you able to breed hardiness and non-sprouting and from the red?
Absolutely. So that's a trait that we're selecting on very hard every year. So every white wheat that goes through the program, it doesn't go past the first year yield trials unless it has good sprout tolerance. So we're out there in the field, and this is Linda Brown, if she's not in this group. She's been directing our sprout screening program where we're selecting heads at physiological maturity after ripening them and deliberately misting them in the greenhouse, applying, just like with scab, we're applying worst case scenario for scab, we do that with sprout as well. And so we can get very good data on which lines resist sprouting at that stage. So that visual sprouting is not always correlated directly with falling number. I mean, that's the trait you're interested in. In white wheat, there's a stronger relationship between the visual sprout and the falling number. But that breaks down a little bit in reds. But that's a trait that and we do provide that data in the state performance trial, and that's something to be looking at, especially if you're growing white wheat. So there are differences among white wheats in resistance to sprouting. And that's definitely a trait we're selecting on. Absolutely.
Is there really anything in the baking milling industry that the sprouting upsets?
Yeah, it's actually the it's the mixing properties of the dough. Now when it's sprouting, that grain is trying to germinate. So all of those starches, those complex they're big, large starch molecules in the grain there. And when that water gets imbibed, it starts to become physiologically active and starts breaking down that starch. So it makes a very poor dough. It really affects the ability to make a good product with that grain. And so there are some tricks. You can do some blending, just like with scab. That there are some tricks that the milling industry can use to mitigate some of that, some of those effects. But the best defense is right here on the front line in the field, just to have a good resistance in those varieties.
Why I asked, first year we went to Arizona years ago, they had like a Walmart with pallets of stuff way up high, and they had sprouted wheat flour.
Oh, sure. I mean, it's good for beer brewing, right?
Oh, I had no idea.
I talked with a brewer once on that. They were using Brundage, a soft white wheat from Idaho, and they had issues malting it. I told them to use some Ambassador from Michigan. So anyway, but yeah, it would facilitate good malting actually. So there's a use for it. Absolutely.
Half the year we get sprouted wheat, and now if I go out there and see they're selling sprouted wheat flour,
yeah,
they docking up.
Well, there's a market for everything. Yeah.
How thick you plant this?
This is at 1.5 million seeds per acre.
Quite thick.
It is, and this was planted very early. This is actually a less than in planting date. So this was in the 3rd week of September that these were planted. So they had a good fall tillering, and they've received 120 pounds of N. So 90 pounds urea and 30 pounds of liquid, 28% this year. So, and you can see the flag leaves are bright green on these, and that's a function of a Feeks 9 application of a strobe triazole product, and then followed with Fusarium. So the white heads you see, that's coming from the soil. So that damage is already done. But yeah, we deliberately kept these healthy. So.
Do you spray any 28 on it?
Yeah. So with streamer bars. Yeah, so we stream it on. Yep. And so you might get a little bit. You might see some damage, from, you know, some burn, but it's minimal. It's minimal.
Is there any minimal amount of physical spray?
That's a good question for Kurt Steinke. His stop is straight ahead over there. Yep. So that's a good question for Kurt and Dan Quinn actually. Yep. All right. Well, we can see a few more varieties here. I want to get to R267. So this is a bearded wheat. Very, very dense heads here. I'm liking this line. So this is actually one of a good red in our program here. So 267 has very good scab resistance. Actually, it's Oasis. Anyone familiar with that variety? Oasis by let's see here. Oasis by D8006. So you can see that on plant type. That's the D8006 plant type that's coming through here. Very good yield potential in this line, good scab resistance. And so this is W250. So this has been a very, very good, it's performed very well. And this is an example of where you can cross the genetics between red wheats and white wheats. So anyone familiar with Shirley, with that variety that's done quite well for a number of years in the state. But this is a cross between Shirley and Ambassador. So you can we've actually been getting really good progeny from this cross. So we haven't. We had very good, good lodging pressure in 2015, and so this has made it through that. Now it's also taller because it was planted earlier as well. Yeah, but okay. So that gets back to your point where this would respond to a PGR if these are a little bit taller. Any of the varieties that are out there now, we've got the data published on that. So you can just compare, the varieties that you're interested in, compare it to that trial mean to get an idea whether it's taller or shorter and whether it would respond, whether it would be worth the investment for the... On our intensively managed trials, yeah, the very first year that we yield test these lines, we just leave them to the world. It's only 90 pounds of urea in the spring, no fungicides, so we really get a good estimate. That's where I'm going this afternoon, is to rate stripe rust down at Mason. So we really need to flush out those weaknesses with it right away. So by this point, we know what those weaknesses are, and we can actually make pretty good recommendations on management. So that's where we're really trying to go towards is a variety by management package, so that you can maximize the yield potential in these varieties. Absolutely. So W300, this line was advanced largely based on its resistance to pre-harvest sprouting, but it has not performed well this year, and I think this is probably the last you'll ever see of this variety here. Now, this line, however, R288, is doing quite well. It's a cross between Shirley and Red Ruby, if you're familiar with that MSU release. It's about 10 years old now, but very good combining ability. So we actually have Shirley in the pedigree of a number of our advanced lines. Now this line, this still needs some cleanup. You can see that there are OND and ONless types. If you cross an OND with an ONless, you do get both types segregating in the progeny. But that's just a function of cleaning it up. It does have scab resistance. It was advanced on scab resistance. So again, we had very good disease. The most important scab-related trait that we are selecting on is actual mycotoxin, so that's DON. So when you go to look at the state variety trial report, there are multiple measurements of scab. You're looking at a disease severity, and that's how far does that disease move within a spike. Is it 30% or 100% of that spike that's infected? But also the DON, the actual mycotoxin values. So lower is better with DON. So those are some important scab traits that we're looking at. So a white wheat that I'm very excited about because we're in an era now where it's not an and or for scab and sprout resistance in white wheats. This line has very good resistance to scab, very good yield potential, but it does also have good sprout tolerance. And it's just been performing very well. Very good broad adaptation. And it's D8006, so you can really see some of the lines that are really showing up in our pedigrees. Again, it does have some eye spot issues from this field here. What's really caused that was the very wet conditions we had in April and all through May, and it hasn't rained for 3.5 weeks. Until this morning, it hasn't rained for 3 weeks here. So it's been hot. So it's those stress conditions that really force that disease. So R330 again. I really like this plant type. It's got 25R47 top cross to D8006. So you can see there are some similarities between this line because they do share a parent. So genetics is remarkable in that regard. So another red wheat that we have that would be very responsive to increased spacing, good planting density. Now you can see this line, it has very erect plant type, very vertical, but it's all stems, it's all tillers, or it's all stems anyway. So this kind of plant type would respond very well to a more compact row, could potentially respond to more compact row spacing here. Row spacing and density. So something like this could respond very well to at least a 2, if not a 2.5 million density. It has very good resistance to stripe rust. This is a D6234, if you remember that older. It's not that old, but it's a very very popular white wheat in Michigan. Crossed to Batavia, that's a New York line. So very stocky, big looking heads on there. Yeah, yep. Just imagine what this would look like with a higher seeding rate. You know, it would just be a tabletop here. Okay, so now R421. Now I keep bringing up the point of tailoring, having a variety tailored to management practices. Now I can understand that 415 wheat, you can hesitate to invest in additional fungicide applications. That's where a variety like 421 would come in. Very good stripe rust resistance and a very good tolerance to intermediate tolerance to leaf spot pathogens. So 2015 was a very wet year. We had great selection on Stegonospora and Septoria leaf spot pathogens, but also scab resistance. So basically this line has a very good disease resistance package. Now I'm not saying that it would benefit from a Persaro application at flowering, as would all of these varieties. So really the best security against scab is a combination of both variety and management practices. It's the synergies between the genetics and the management applications that really provide risk mitigation for scab. So this W598, this is an example of a very, very long, elegant, very large spike. Very, very different plant type than say R213 or R11 that we saw earlier on. Very long spike. Good lush. It's a lot of biomass. And so this is just a cross between two MSU experimental lines, but it's nicked very well. So it has good adaptation to the thumb growing environments, but that just gets it's a very different plant type than say the R489 that we just saw. It's remarkable the diversity in the genetics of these wheat varieties. They're more different from each other than the people in this crowd are from each other. It's quite remarkable. And the genetics here, if you can really see the similarities between the parents of these lines and their offspring. This line R593 is 50% Hopewell right here. This next plot over here. That's Hopewell that we have planted in the borders. Red Dragon. It is Red Dragon. Yes. Okay, then they probably share some pedigree then. I swear it looks like Hopewell. But anyway, so this is 50% Hopewell crossed to an MSU experimental line. It's performing very well actually. It's a good combiner, so we've actually had very good crosses with this line. It's one of the better combiners in the program. So the last experimental line that we have is W652. It's got good yield potential. It's the most sprout tolerant white wheat that we have in the program. So I'm really looking forward to release of this line. It's got D6234 crossed to another parent that I'm not too familiar with, but it's intermediate to scab, so it would require some diligence in controlling scab. But it does have really good tolerance to sprout, and we need to continue investigations into that, how it affects standability, germination. But as of right now at harvest, this is one of the better lines for sprout resistance. Now the variety by management example, a classic example of that is Ambassador here, where it's susceptible to most foliar pathogens, but covering up its weaknesses really brings out the yield potential in this line. So it's a very good combiner. We have a lot of crosses with Ambassador, but you can see it looks very good under intensive management. 120 pounds of nitrogen and 2 fungicide applications. And here's some other lines in the program. Jupiter is probably the most widely planted white wheat this fall. Well, last fall, and it's this year. I've seen it. You can see this from the road. This day glow green. You can't mistake it from the road. But really, what its redeeming factor has been is stripe rust resistance. It doesn't need redemption. It's a very good line. It's a little bit later maturity, so it's actually favored in Huron and Sanilac counties that have an additional couple days of grain fill. So it's really adapted to the white wheat region. And here's Red Ruby. It's a very attractive line, very good looking line, pioneer pedigree. It's about 10 years old now. It's not very widely grown anymore, but we do have, as you've seen, we do have some pedigrees with it. Any other questions or comments? Lee?
1 minute.
1 minute for questions.
I'm just curious, you have a field that you put weed after weed after weed continuously?
We don't. I would be terrified to see what that looks like. Rotations are good. Good, okay. All right, thank you everyone. Very good to see you today.